I'm here with Dan Taylor. This is going to be a podcast about, when I say we're going to do a podcast about story, but in a lot of ways that just means kind of about everything. So We'll just talk about everything. I didn't even before we were recording, we were talking about a bunch of different things. Who is Dan Taylor? Who are you? And what do you
anyway?
do? What have you done? Yeah.
Anyways, and why are you here?
Right.
I was for 40 years, or more or less, an English professor. And I quit a little bit early to give me more time for writing. So I guess I can now call myself a writer, although I've always been hesitant to do that, even though I've written a lot of books, because I think writers are Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, and I'm not. Sure. Grew up in California, mostly Southern California and Texas. Find that when I talk about almost anything, laying somewhere underneath there is the idea, two ideas really. One is story, because I think God's telling the world a story and we're invited to be characters in it. So a lot of how I think about my own life or my kids or my family comes from this sense that I need to be a certain kind of character, and I want to be a certain kind of character in this story God's telling the world.
Yeah.
And the other word that comes up when I'm thinking about, sort of ultimate things is shalom. Yeah. Which is, my definition is just how things ought to be. It's how God created things to be. And I think stories, certainly novels and a lot of literary stories, but in many other kinds of stories as well, are centered on ruptures in shalom. And the whole story, the plot is, how is shalom broken? How are these characters going to deal with it?
Because shalom means peace, right?
Well, it means, actually shalom means about a dozen different things. Right. But peace is one of them. It means wholeness is another thing.
Completeness, it's the seven.
And it means order, and it means safety, and it means, the Bible translates that shalom root many different ways, and it should.
Well, it's important that people actually understand what that means. Because I was looking at it a couple of years ago. What is peace in the Bible? Because I think peace is a fruit of the Spirit, and the American or English understanding of peace, generally speaking, is the absence of conflict, right? That's not the biblical understanding of peace, actually. And
it's much richer than that.
Right. If Jesus operated out of the English version of peace, he would be like he
would have stayed out of Jerusalem.
He wouldn't have gone anywhere. He wouldn't have done anything. So I think this is one of the things that I've really seen be interesting in the American church right now is there are all these words that mean something to Jesus, means something in the Greek and the Hebrew, that we have projected our English understanding on. And is it intentional or not? I mean, J. Gresham Machen writes about this a little bit, and it in some ways creates an entirely new religion. And so you're talking about shalom, and so what have you seen as the impact of, I guess, pursuing completeness and wholeness rather than just getting away from conflict?
Well, I mean, shalom becomes, for me, it's a directive. It's it's how I judge so many things, even politically. How am I going to vote? I want to vote in a way that I think encourages shalom. And in our culture, we've emptied out a lot of things. We've made them very superficial and very thin. And one of our, I can't remember which one it was, but one of our Christian thinkers from the last generation said, it's true of Christianity. Christianity in America, he says, is 4,000 miles wide and an inch deep. And so peace happens when shalom is present, and including the lack of conflict. But shalom is everything working as God intended. So when people, if I'm asked, well, what's the church supposed to be about? I say the church should be about the same thing that every individual should be about, which is repairing and extending shalom. So you can talk about that in terms of God's kingdom or there's lots of other ways to talk about that. But essentially, you're trying to repair creation.
Yeah.
And so when I think about story, for instance, in churches or in politics, anywhere there are leaders, what is a leader? A leader is someone whose job is to maintain the story.
Yeah.
Maintain maybe is too shallow a word, but to help the story flourish.
Yeah.
So a faithful church is one that tells the story in a way that's winsome.
Yeah.
Because the gospel is winsome, but also doesn't shy away from sin and some people say the gospel is bad news before it's good news.
Yeah. Right.
And so they don't wince at that.
Yeah.
And if the church and under the leadership of people who are dedicated to the story, if the church lives that out, then people will stop leaving.
Yeah.
Right. It'll be attractive.
Right.
But too often we reduce it to lesser things. Yeah.
The idea of shalom was helpful for me as I tried to figure out, as I we talked a little bit before this podcast. My generation is the generation of expressive individualism. The whole purpose and aim in life is to express whatever you feel, whenever you feel, however you feel, and right. That mostly manifests itself in like sexual deviancy, and that's about it. But so that's what I thought life was about for like most of my childhood. I had these conflicting narratives, right? My parents were like, no, this is about Christ, putting Christ first. Mm-hmm. But then I went to public schools, and public schools like, no, it's Freudian, it's sex. That's the main purpose and goal of your life. And anything that gets in the way of what you're pursuing is something that you need to get rid of. Yes. And whereas the Christian call is, oftentimes, anything that gets in the way of what you're pursuing, which is Christ, you need to go through. You need to mortify the flesh. Right. You need to kill the flesh. And that's two different worldviews entirely. Right. Well, and that shook me. Like, I didn't even know how to deal with that because Christ was calling me into conflict in a lot of scenarios rather than away from it.
Right. Well, every society, I said God is telling the world a story, but every society tells the world a story, tells that society a story. So what is the story that society, expressive individualism is one part of it, but is telling its young people and everybody else. Every society tells you what a successful life is.
Yeah.
So in America, it's basically possessions, prestige, power, and pleasure.
Yeah, right.
And if you have those things, you should have a successful life. Right. But too many people who get them all, or 3 out of 4, say, Why am I not fulfilled? Why doesn't my life have any meaning? And it's because it's basically a false story.
Yeah.
And so there's healthy stories and there's unhealthy stories. And the one example of grace is that God has created things in such a way that you can move from one to the other. You can move from an unhealthy story,
right?
Because He's given you free will. He's given you choice, ability to choose.
Yeah.
So, tell the story. There's, a lot of hymns used to talk about tell it on the mountain. Tell me the old story. Yeah.
I
sang them all in the 50s as a little kid, but I think they've been replaced by what one of my more skeptical scholar friends called 7-Eleven songs, where you say 7 words 11 times.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Yeah. I can't stand modern worship music. It's there's a serious problem with it. I actually interviewed a guy about a year ago who wrote a book. He's a Catholic. His name is Patrick Deneen. He's a political philosopher from Notre Dame. He wrote a book called Why Liberalism Failed.
I read that book.
Yeah, it's a great book, but his whole idea is liberalism failed because it succeeded. What it set out to do in of course, this is talking about the more negative view of liberty philosophically, is to break away from all constraints and just do whatever you want. Right. We pursued those as a society, the 4 or 5 things: pleasure, prestige, prosperity, and in pursuing all of those, it devoured itself, because that in and of itself, it's paradoxical and it's really weird. And we're seeing that, I think, right now, how that's playing out today in culture, is that we're the richest we've ever been, and we feel the most worthless and useless than we've ever felt.
Right. Suicide rates.
Yeah.
Historic highs.
Yeah.
Right.
Why is that? Why? Because there's a paradoxical mystery of story, right? Regardless of what story it is. Like I love G.K. Chesterton's book, Orthodoxy. And his whole thing is at the center of Christianity is a paradox, right?
First shall be last, among others.
Yeah, right. And he talks about, I'm going to botch this, but it was paraphrasing in a way, but he talks about the shape of the cross and how the other shapes can't get bigger without losing something, but the cross can get bigger and bigger without losing its
keeps
core.
it proportion.
Exactly. The same proportion, right. And so what is that? So let's just contrast maybe Chesterton's paradoxical center of Christianity and then Patrick Deneen's kind of paradoxical center of liberalism or just secularism. What is, I don't know, have you thought about this? Like what is happening there? Why does there have to be a paradox at the center of the story? And then have you thought about that? Is there a paradox? Why there has to be a paradox?
Well, no. I'll just say no.
Okay, sure.
I mean, I'll let that be his main assertion that there's paradox. I think that there are profound paradoxes and there are trivial paradoxes.
Okay, yeah.
So Christianity has profound paradoxes such as crucifixion can lead to resurrection.
Yeah, right.
And the first shall be last, and which isn't a competitive kind of thing of who gets in line first. It is it is the world's notion of what's first. Yeah, might turn out to be the last thing that's really important for you. Yeah, that kind of stuff. So I think you can think of paradoxes at the heart of the Christian story.
I've noticed that. Well, in your book, is it Tell Me a Story, right? That's you begin by explaining how there's a story at really the center of everything that we do, right? And it's weird because when I started reading it, like the story, everybody knows stories. Sure, everybody's like, come on, like
it's
story.
Too familiar.
Yeah, it's too familiar. But then you start to explain it. I'm like, oh yeah, it's actually like, why do I get up at the time that I get up, and why do I go the places that I go and talk to the people that I talk to?
Or why do I believe the things? Why does this thing disgust me and this thing attracts me? Where does my value come from? Right. I mean, basically, if you want just to start with biology, the brain insists on a story. The brain, not only is God made the brain. God is telling the world a story. The brain wants a story. So the brain takes in all of this overload of sensory data and looking for a plot. Yes. Because it gets really anxious if there's no plot. Yeah. And so why are we hooked on stories? Because God made us that way and the brain insists on it. And so what is a story? A story is the telling of the significant actions of characters over time. And that's true of a life story. It's true of a novel, So a question we have to ask is, what story am I a character in? Well, and people choose badly, because the culture will give them fake stories or, dead end stories. Yeah. So you've got to find if you want a rich life, you've got to have the richest stories. Yeah. The biological thing is I actually was listening to Jordan Peterson's, he did some lectures on a book that he wrote called Maps of Meaning. And he talks a little bit about how when we're looking at things in a room, like you can't, your senses that you're taking in a lot, but you can't focus on everything or you just like explode. I don't know what would happen. You have sensory overload. And so you're constantly making decisions, subconsciously making decisions on what's the most important thing to look at in a particular room all the time. And that's that is, even though there's all these peripheral things that you could look at, your eyes, your biology, whatever is happening. I don't know how that works as far as free will and predeterminism goes, things like that. Which, by the way, is depressing to teachers and pastors when you realize even the person sitting there supposedly looking at you has a million things they can be thinking about besides what you're saying.
Right.
Yeah.
So why is, and you're saying that that's part of God created us that way for particular purpose and reason. What is that particular purpose and reason? Why is it that it's not even, for me, I think about, okay, God could have just created us to, like be open to hearing stories, but why is it so particular down to the way that we biologically function without us even understanding it, that God created us for story?
Yeah, I don't know if this is an answer to that question or not, but it's what occurs to me. One reason for the power of stories and the universality of them is because they appeal to us as whole creatures. So stories appeal to your intellect and your mind, whatever you include under mind. They appeal to your emotions. They appeal to your will. And that's why stories are so crucial, because, all of those things are involved in the choices you make in life. And so stories are directive. A good story basically tells you how to live.
Right.
And or warns you about how not to live. Or just shows the consequences of choosing badly. I mean, not every important story, has a happy ending or at all. And because you have to, that's part of the shalom thing.
Yeah.
But that's also part of our physicality. I mean, if to avoid being a Gnostic, you have to affirm what God affirmed by making creatures. Right. So he made the brain this way, in part because, maybe almost wholly because it's the way he chooses to communicate with us. So how does God relate to his creation? Basically through stories. So what's the Bible? The Bible is a collection of stories of all kinds, and has poetry, but poetry is often a story. And it also has a lot of assertions, and people talk about rules. And some forms of Christianity focus on the assertions. What are the commandments? What are the things you don't want to do wrong? And they shake, you're in trouble if you break the commandment. And the rabbis say there's like over 600 commandments in the Bible.
613.
But the commandments and the assertions all take place within a story.
Right.
So why are the 10 commandments? Because there are 613. Why are these 10 so important? Well, because at that point in the story, people of Israel needed to hear those 10.
Right.
Because they were on a journey and they were surrounded by other gods. So the first one is there's only one God and you got him, and don't be distracted by these other guys. They also, and the commandment about keeping the Sabbath, that's about worship, how to worship God. And then most of the others are about how to get along with people, because you're in a tent, probably with 2 or 3 generations in your tent. And the guy next door is about 2 feet away. And so all these behavioral things, don't lust, don't covet, don't, because this is where you are now. You're on this long journey. So other commands. So I think we need a balance. We need to know, to understand the commands in the context of the story. But the commands also help us to understand the story correctly. So we are able to misinterpret the story, including the biblical story.
Right.
And so the command also is necessary, but they work together.
This is something I've been thinking about theologically for a little while, just actually for a couple of years, that John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. I grew up in churches, and I would say, what does that mean? That doesn't make any sense. Actually, like grammatically, like doesn't make any sense in a lot of ways too. It's like the Word is God. And people would just be like, that just means that like Jesus is God. And it's like, in verse 14, I think that's where it says the Word takes on flesh and dwelt among us. We know that that's kind of the beginning works of the theology of the Trinity, but what does that verse mean? Like, so I did a biblical interpretation class where we had to take 4 verses and really just focus in on those 4. Mine was John 1:1 through 4. And the thing that I found that was fascinating about that was, well, one, the word logos in Greek has like 2 really different definitions. One of them is just word, right, that we speak and write down. And then the other one is kind of the philosophical, the old philosophers would be kind of searching for the logos, and then the logos would be this like divine reason and wisdom or something like that. But it was always abstracted. It was always this thing outside of us, and it wasn't necessarily part of the physical. It was a metaphysical reality. And that thing that blew my mind, it kind of, I think, connects to what you're saying about what we were talking about with biology and Christ himself at the center of the story is that John 1:1 is John's philosophical dissertation against the philosophers that come before him. And he's saying, you're all looking for the metaphysical, but the metaphysical and the physical all converged in Jesus. It's like he comes to earth, he takes on flesh. And so the word, which is really the word like that we're speaking, also is flesh, and it comes and takes this thing on. And that kind of blew my mind a little bit because I think then it makes sense of a lot of the things that we're talking about why do your eyes fixate on things? Why is your body kind of predispositioned to go in particular ways and do particular things that we don't fully understand?
Right.
I think it has to do with being made in the image of God, which is in some ways summed up in John 1:1 or is really made sense of. So.
Well, but for every verse like John 1:1, if you keep reading, as you say in the book of John, a story will come in and turn the abstraction and even the philosophical puzzle into flesh.
Yes.
Okay, it's got characters, it's got dialogue, it's got plot. And now I start to understand. I mean, I sometimes would say to students, I love philosophy. I probably would have been a philosophy major if I hadn't succumbed to lit early on. But philosophy could write volumes about what is love.
Yeah.
But you ask Shakespeare, what is love? And he says, let me tell you a story about this guy named Romeo and this girl named Juliet. And most people will understand a little bit more about love from Romeo and Juliet than from 10 volumes of abstract reasoning. So one of the reasons story is important is because it turns abstractions not only into, I would say it turns abstractions into experiences. So you experience something about love from Romeo and Juliet, or you experience something about God's love through a story of David and Jonathan or whatever kind of thing, that the pure abstract statement, it's true. I mean, you don't want to argue against it, and you even can profit from the abstraction. Yeah. But when it's worked out in story, then it can start to really influence you as a whole person, not just as a mind. Yeah. So a lot of people know a lot about the Bible. Yeah. A lot of facts about the Bible, and they can discuss it and argue it really well. But how much have the stories actually shaped the way that their own story plays out? This is what was convicting for me when I started reading J.I. Packer. One of the things that he said that I was shocked by, he was like, look, there are people who are theologically wrong on some things that are pretty important. I mean, not like the Trinity, but like some pretty important things that live for Christ. They do. It's producing something. They're doing something for Christ. And there are people who know a lot of stuff and they don't do anything for Christ. Right. And he's like, if your theology isn't producing an affection for Christ, isn't producing a life for Christ, then it sucks. It's just not. He doesn't say it that way. He says it like that the way that J.I. Packer that's not a quote. Yeah. No. But I was my version of it. This is how it comes into my head. But it's like it's not good. You have to your theology should be producing something. Now, on the other end of what you're saying, that the abstract, we could have volumes about what love is. On the other end of that, there's like the nature part of things, right? Like people who just operate out of nature, I think sin nature, that then it becomes animalistic. And so story seems to be the place where again, metaphysical and physical just come right together, and you get to see the philosophical dissertation actually work itself out in the natural world. Right. Well, but at the same time, we have to emphasize that there are healthy and unhealthy stories. Mm-hmm. So not every story is a good story. Oh yeah, right. And a lot of what's going on in the world are collisions of stories, story collisions. And I think that's basically what politics is. You got, in our case, 2 parties, but in other places, 20 parties, all telling a story.
Yeah.
And they have a narrative, and in individual relationships, people have a narrative about what you're doing to me and what I'm doing to you.
Yeah.
And some of those stories are destructive, and some of them are healthy. And so, one of the things the Bible does is help you choose good story. You have your overarching, what I call a master story. I mean, I think I made up of thousands of stories. I was born into them, and they started with my ancestors and filtered through. But my master story that I give allegiance to and want to act as the primary guide for my life is Christianity. It's a Christian faith. Yeah. There was a Jewish fellow who rose. I'm probably going to get it wrong, so I won't guess. Who says, and every religion, but I would say every philosophy has master stories. So he said the master story for the Jews is the Exodus. Yeah. And he says the master story for Christians is the Easter story.
Yeah, right.
And that's the story that you read, that both tells you how to choose, and when you have a society that's got endless choices. Yeah. But also when you fail or when you suffer or when you lose someone, you can return to your master story to tell you how to think about it or how to feel about it or how to. So master stories help determine our values, and they also give consolation and direction and all these kinds of things.
I do have a question about the political world, which is probably like nobody wants to hear about
make
politics
everybody
anymore.
angry. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Let's do that right now. I'm fine with that because I'm trying to figure this out. Like, how do you think through politics from a Christian worldview, especially in right now we're not doing well. For Christians are homeless. I mean, true Orthodox Christians are homeless in the political world, I think, right now. So do you think that politically, as these stories come about, and how should society flourish, or how can society flourish? That's what, right now you have the Republicans and the Democrats. I think they're both operating out of a more liberal worldview. The Republicans are just a little less liberal than the Democrats right now, just a little bit less, but in a couple of years they'll probably, be right up with them. And then you have like the more Judeo-Christian conservative stream of thought that's not popular, but it is, I think, correct. There's this idea within Christian, the Orthodox Christian conservative stream of political thought that thinks that integrating the Christian story as best we can with the cultural story is the best way to try to pull vote. I can't, but probably because I'm growing up in this time. Like, I bet if I was alive 100 years ago, I'd be like, yeah, that sounds great. But what do you think about the integration of the Christian story into other stories?
Well, again, at one time I could have told you a lot more detail, but somebody, a generation ago talked about 4 different approaches: Christ against culture, Christ of culture, Christ and culture in relationship, et cetera, et cetera. I think my big concern with, one of them was Christ transforming culture, which I think was applied to reform people, especially that we can. And I just don't think that seems to be happening, or I'm not even sure it can happen.
The transforming?
Yeah. Aspect. I mean, that we can be so successful as believers that the culture will start to take on our What did you think?
What would you say about Christendom? Like, what would you say about? And look, I'm not arguing for it. I'm just wondering, because that's an argument. I've thought through that. What happens? Because if it's unattainable, then what's the purpose of being politically active as a Christian?
Well, there's a difference between being politically active as a Christian and seeking power, seeking worldly power, dominion. So I think you can make the case, people disagree, that the church has been healthiest when it's been least accepted. And So a lot of people, lament, for instance, that church seems to be declining in attendance and Christians. And if there's one point of view is it's not, the church is not dying, it's being pruned.
Exactly.
It's being winnowed.
Right.
And so
getting all the cultural.
The church, for me, the main thing the church can do politically is to model such a healthy story, alternative story to what, in this case, either party is modeling for us, that they attract people who are hungry for meaning and the values that the church exists for.
And do you think that through history that attractiveness is going to expand and then deflate and expand and deflate? Because I wonder, like we were talking a little bit about Francis Schaeffer before we started recording, and he talks about like the contrast between the High Renaissance and then the Reformation, and how they produce different types of art. And his argument was the Renaissance is producing a ideal humanistic vision, and the Renaissance is producing it's like a Reformed Christian vision. And
Reformed,
and then he said something that I was like totally shocked by: the statue of David. Everybody thinks that that's a David of the Bible, but it's David's uncircumcised in the statue of David. So it's not.
I never looked that close.
Neither did I. But it's uncircumcised. So he's not the David of the Bible. He's actually just the ideal human. It's humanism.
Well, see, that would be a observation that I've never had to consider.
It's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is true. I think it's true that the culture will borrow from Christianity, but they'll use it for their own purposes.
Yeah, right.
I mean, who's the fellow, Tom somebody, who's written a big book, a very popular book about, and others, and even Dawkins has sort of taken the stand that all of them, much of the ideology of I'll just use the word the left about fairness and justice and equity, all this stuff. It's straight from the Bible. It's Judeo-Christian, you know. I mean, and they don't recognize it at all. They see Christianity as an enemy. And if you look selectively at history, you could make that case. Sure, but so
you're saying they're pulling these virtues from Scripture, maybe subconsciously, because we've kind of been built on that in the West, and then would you agree that they're perverting those, though?
Of course. Well, you gave the example earlier of the idea of freedom.
Yeah. Right.
All right. So freedom is a biblical notion, but as you pointed out, our culture takes freedom to mean freedom from, not freedom to. Right. The Bible says you are free to do these good things. Yeah. And our definition of freedom as a culture is nobody can tell me what to do. Yeah. Right. And the restraints. My counter assertion is, will somebody please tell me what to do? Yeah. And that's what we need. Right. And so who better to tell us what to do than the Creator? Right. Who actually knows how we work. So so instead of this view of the law as this negative, it's restricting me and I can't have fun with the law. Look at the law as this is the operating instructions. Yeah. You know, you spend $1,000 for a dress, you're going to read the washing instructions to see how not to ruin your dress. Yeah, right. So God has made the creation. Let's go and look at the operating instructions. Mm-hmm. I think Annie Dillard has not Annie Dillard too. It is anyway, forget me. Let's look at the operating instruction to see how to flourish. Yeah, right. Right. So why is sexual why is biblical sexual conduct a good? Mm-hmm. Because God knows it helps us flourish when there are restrictions and there's devotion and constancy and these kind of things, and not. Right. You know, but the culture will take that Christian value of freedom and say, well, no, that means I can sleep around. Yeah. You know. So what's his name? The Kentucky guy says, oftentimes we think we're flying when we're only falling. Oh, really? Yeah. Which I think that's a great metaphor. Absolutely. A lot of time culture says, oh, this is the way to fly. Right. No, you're not flying. You're falling and you're going to splat here. Yeah. And we are, as a culture, we're splatting basically.
I
mean, we're in decline. Yeah. And back to story, it's because we no longer believe our founding stories.
Yeah. And this is where I think Jordan Peterson is helpful, at least for me, as he, in some ways is frustrating because I feel like he can't find, he's recognizing that the story that the culture is telling is apocalyptic and catastrophic, right? Everything's going to end, and it's the climate change thing, it's all that stuff. Everything's over in 10 years. And then he built this whole organization called ARC. It's the Alliances for Responsible Citizenship, in which they're trying to find kind of a new story to tell society. And I'm like, look, I think it's kind of cool, but also the Bible, you don't need to start an organization like that.
And you don't need to emphasize the word new.
Right.
Because that's a cultural value for us. New has to be better than old. Right. And progress has to be better than conserving wisdom, because we don't think it's wise anymore. So, if you want to help society return to some things, not what's the brand new thing.
Yeah, right. And I don't know if I think he does look historically, but there's I think that do you agree that there are the societal story right now, or the popular story right now is one of like catastrophe, and that people are going to just, I think the climate change is really the real underlying story. Right. Do you agree that that's like, is that a...
Well, the quickest way to power in America today is to claim unfairness.
Sure.
And again, I think America probably has had its run as a superpower, and it won't end in my lifetime, but maybe it'll linger on for a while, because we
think so?
Oh yeah, just because we have a lot of resources and we still have some good systems in place. But us as a model probably is over.
Really?
And that's partly because we don't have faith in our own stories. We used to tell ourselves we were good people. Now we tell ourselves we're racists and homophobes and all this kind of stuff. And Kamala is, I think they did a focus group or two and decided that we've got to say we're all about joy.
Oh my gosh.
Which is, it's almost laughable, but it also is, she realizes that, her party's basically been saying democracy's done if we don't win. And the other party is saying the country's going to collapse if we don't win. Right. So they're very negative. Yeah. Yeah. And America for a couple hundred years was known as an optimistic people, and we can do things. And to the extent that we substitute all these woe is me stories for more positive stories, and the most positive story around is God loves you, God made you, God loves you, God calls you. I mean, that's for me, that's the plot. That's the both thematic and plot summary of the Bible. God made you, God loves you, God calls you. And so there's all these individual stories, but there's also the overarching, salvation history story, which the Germans kindly said is Heilsgeschichte.
What does that mean?
Salvation history.
Oh, that's what they call it. Okay. Gotcha.
Which I learned, as a freshman, I think, in college. And I thought, well, that's a great word. I'm going to remember that. Heilsgeschichte.
Yeah.
But somebody listening probably is going to tell me I've got that totally wrong.
Yeah, well,
but they're not here.
The concept that matters, right? Yeah. I think that the interesting thing, too, about the Kamala messaging and the Trump messaging right now is that, and like I can't remember if I said this in the last podcast we did or this podcast, but the Republican Party and the Democrat Party the Democrat Party is just a little bit more liberal than the Republican Party. And what was interesting is that at the DNC in Chicago, there's this joy. They're talking about how everything's about joy, and outside in the parking lot, they're doing abortions, right? They're like, I think they 30 or 40 abortions. They're like murdering children. And then Trump's catastrophe, his whole catastrophe, America's going to end if I don't get in. What does he do then? He compromises on abortion himself on the problem of abortion. So it's like both of these catastrophic worldviews seem to be producing really horrific ideologies around like the worst possible thing that you could possibly think of, like killing babies, which if I could point to one thing that Jesus was most angry about in the Bible, it's well, there's two. One is defiling the temple, using the temple for what it's not meant for, as he drove all the people away and flipped the tables. But then really when he told people it'd be better if somebody were to tie a millstone around your neck and throw you into the sea than for you to lead a child astray, which I think within that would include murdering children, right? And so why is it that these stories, though they're catastrophic, why do they produce such, like, that's such an evil thing?
Well, I'm back to biology again.
Yeah.
The brain, and the media has learned this long ago, and they play these three notes constantly. The brain reacts to three things. I mean, probably a lot of things, but one is fear. And the brain is just conditioned to pay attention if there's fear.
Yeah.
The other is anger, and the third is sentimentality.
Interesting.
So if you can make people angry, or you can make them afraid, or you can appeal to the kind of squishy emotion, it motivates them. It affects how they act in the world, and what they, not only what they believe in their head, but how they act, including how they vote.
Right.
So, politicians and all the people who help them get in power constantly have their finger to the wind.
Yeah.
And what's the story that is going to sell? And what they find that works over and over again is anger, fear, or sentimentality.
Yeah. Yeah. So what do we do going forward? Would your vision be to tell? Well, okay, I'll tell you what I think we should do going forward. You can just tell me if I'm wrong. So
you're probably at least partially wrong.
Probably, yeah.
I'll correct you though, so don't worry.
1 or 2%. But so I mean, my idea is, I mean, we obviously have to tell a better story, but I think we have to tell that the Christians need to tell that story. And they need to tell that story through. It's a thing that we're working on at Rocket Sled. We're putting together an animated children's series on a series called Tales of the Kingdom from the 80s, written by David and Karen Maines. And it's the thing that happened with C.S. Lewis, and it's the thing that happened with J.R. Tolkien and even Chesterton. They seem to be able to tap into whatever that is, that metaphysical and physical reality coming together and creating real life. I mean, stories, obviously Narnia didn't happen, but it feels real life, when you're reading it. They created these stories that impacted millions and millions of people. And I think the church weirdly seems to be in America right now. There's like all these different groups doing all these different things to save the culture. Yeah. And then I'm like, but like none of you are actually doing anything that's going to actually help save the culture, half of them are trying to integrate with the gross culture that we live in. They're like, oh, we can get rid of sexual ethics in the church and then we'll just get people. And it's like, okay, that doesn't actually work.
If we copy the culture, we'll be more popular.
Yeah, people will like it. It's like, yes, they'll just keep liking the thing that they're doing and then feel a little bit more moral doing it. And then you have other people who fully want to reject the culture in every way, shape, and form and isolate themselves. And I've seen this happen on the kind of the far right in a lot of ways, isolation from everything and just to go into a hole. I think both those ideas are ridiculously stupid. And there's something there kind of in between, not even in between. It's a different stream in and of itself in which I think we need to tell the truth of Christ clearly in the culture, but through stories like Chronicles of Narnia and The Lord of the Rings that are like tugging on this subconscious thing that people have. And so do you agree with that? Do you think that's what we should be doing?
I certainly think it's in the right direction. But I wouldn't discourage anybody who says, I don't write stories. I understand. Sure, and then I would say, well, then find the way that you can repair and extend shalom in your field, in your area. So I was very influenced as a young man in college age by Albert Camus, who was a atheistic existentialist, but he had tremendous integrity, and he was fair, and that was appealing to me.
That's bizarre too.
But he gave a talk once to a group of monks, and his advice to the monks was, be Christian, be as Christian as you can be.
Interesting.
Don't try to. Don't be like us. I'm not trying to be like you, so you don't try to be like us. And then, and if you are faithful to your story, I don't think he uses the term story, you'll be influential.
Yeah.
So the beginning of transforming culture is to live the story yourself healthily, but don't depend on being able to do it by yourself. Find the community that you live it together.
Right.
And then seek to expand that community, to be attractive, to always be open to, new people, people coming in, but don't compromise your story in order to be attractive, because actually it doesn't work.
Yeah.
People are actually a little bit hungry for somebody who has conviction and says, I think this is true.
I've said this for a couple of years, just seeing people my age be very lost in how they've interacted with the world. One Abigail Schreier wrote a book called Irreversible Damage, and she talks about, and she's not a Christian, she's just a journalist, and she really studied the transgender craze in society in America and in Europe, and especially young girls from age, I think 14 to 18, who identify as transgender, has increased in America by 1,000%, and in Europe by 4,000%. This is a big problem. And so she's a journalist. She's not a Christian. She doesn't have an agenda. She's just trying to figure it out. I think one of the things that she came away with, and one of the things that I came away with in discussing this book a lot with my wife over the last couple of years, is that there's a reality to the transgender craze in that every kid goes through a phase, probably in their teenage years, where they want to rebel, right? Like, back in like the 50s or whatever, they'd smoke a cigarette or have a beer.
You can't have self-respect without rebelling.
Right. You want to rebel. And then,
because that's our idea of freedom.
It is. But I also think that pushing against and rebelling against your parents in a lot of these cases, or against like the institutions, I think deep down what people are looking for is for somebody to say, look, I love you too much to say yes to that. I'm going to tell you no. And over the past 70, 80 years, that parents have just affirmed their kids in all of the rebellion. Oh, you want to smoke? Fine. You want to drink? I'll buy it for you. You want to like have sex all the time? Sure. Like, I'll get you some condoms. And like, that's been kind of, so now kids have pushed it further and further and further and further. And now they're like, oh, I want to actually change my gender. And the parents, what they want, I don't even think that they'd be able to consciously articulate this, but what they really want is for somebody to love them enough to say, no, you cannot do. I love you too much to let you ruin your life and to create something out of yourself that is irreversible. And nobody's doing that. Nobody's saying that. The church shouldn't, they're not saying, like, the churches, like there's the biggest church in my city in Madison, massive evangelical church. And they're like one of the front leading evangelical free churches in the country. They practice what they call gender hospitality. Do you know what that is? Where you just like tell people, so if there's in the youth group, if the kid thinks that they're a girl, but they're actually a boy, they'll call them what they want to be called, not what they are. Right. And that's lying. Like, that's actually biblically just lying. Right. But that desire to rebel, and I think that building up kind of what you're saying, like the church is being committed to their story, the story of the truth, and pushing back against some of these younger people, saying, look, I love you too much to let you do this thing. Like, you can't do that. Is that part of the story? Because you mentioned the three. What did you mention? Like, we're created, and then you kind of your 3-point story. Oh yeah, God made us, God loves us, God calls us. What place in there? Where do you put the fallenness of man in there? The sinful. Well, because He loves us, He calls us out of our sin. Out of our sin. Yeah. I mean, the fall is absolutely. I mean, for me, the fall is the least controversial Christian theological declaration, because everybody understands we live in a fallen world, even if they don't believe anything about God making it. So, and I think actually it's in politics, I won't get too specific here, but one of the great delusions, one of the great failings, and it happens in both parties, is a failure to understand the significance and the extent of the fall. Yeah. Yeah. And therefore falling for illusions, delusions, unrealities of all kinds, because we don't have a proper understanding of our characters, and our character. You know, so I try to, think about the idea of a character in a novel or in any story, also in terms of
the idea of moral character, ethical character. And, what is ethical character? It's values in action. And that's what we're attracted to that in a movie or a novel of what choices is this character making and what are the consequences going to be?
Yeah.
And they almost are always getting in jams. This is Shalom falling apart. Are they going to get out of it? Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. If so, how?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times people are attracted to what is essentially a biblical understanding, which is, I think, almost the most energizing and powerful force in a story is moral courage. And what's Jesus all about except moral courage and speaking truth to power and all these phrases we use.
Right.
And when we see it in action in a story, we are attracted to it.
Yeah.
So that calls on Christians and the church to show some moral courage, which is, it requires wisdom. What is wisdom? I mean, I talk about spiritual legacy that we need to pass on to our culture and to our kids. A spiritual legacy is passing on two things: is operating in somebody's life in two ways to pass on wisdom and blessing. So what is my goal? What should be my goal as a parent now, as a grandparent, is I want to share and pass on to my kids and my grandkids wisdom and blessing.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I have a 1.5-year-old, and we turned on Lion King the other day. Yeah. And I didn't realize how, I'm not saying the story is Christian, but it pulls, so Simba's dad, Mufasa dies, right? Simba goes off and he meets these like hippie friends who just Hakuna Matata everything, no worries.
It's all party.
Right. And then his Nala, his childhood friend, she finds him and she's like, you got to come back and be the king. You have a responsibility to fill. Right. And he's like, no, I'm not doing that. No worries. Hakuna Matata, no worries. And she's like, that's just not how things work. Then he has a confrontation kind of with his dad spiritually, and he realizes, I do have a responsibility, and I need to get rid of the ideology of no worries, nothing matters. Right. I have to go and fulfill this because people depend on me. And that's the thing that my generation is completely thrown away. There is no sense of responsibility for nobody feels like anything depends on them.
You got to be true to yourself.
Yeah, to be true to yourself. Like if your marriage isn't making you happy, then get divorced. It's like, what are you talking about? There's you have 3 kids together. What do you mean just get divorced? So I think that there's I was actually thinking about this morning that I don't know what it is, but there was something very attractive to me about the last 5 years. I'm 25. And I wasn't married when I was 20, but I was trying to figure out exactly what to do with my life. And I remember I was listening to a lot of Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro, which is kind of funny because it wasn't like Christians that convinced me of this. It was actually just a Jewish guy and like a psychology professor. And they kept talking about the greatest adventure of your life is going to be the one in which you go get married and have kids. And I was like, I don't fully understand that because that's not the message that I've been taught. Like the greatest adventure of my life that I've been taught is make as much money as you can and have sex with as many people as you possibly can. Right. And I read the book, The Right Side of History by Ben Shapiro, in which he just discusses kind of very base level, how did we get to where we are in society? What made the West great? It was reason and morality. At the end of it, I never read what is it called? The prologue or anything? Or what is that afterwards or before? The afterwards. I never read the afterwards. I never do that. I probably should. But I did this time for some reason. And Shapiro talks about talking with his daughter about these exact themes, about the responsibilities that you have to step into, that you have these responsibilities to step into that have been given to you from your ancestors who also sacrificed and did the same thing. And there's something like really powerful about that I'd never heard in my entire life. Yeah. And I was like, I need to go get married and have kids. So I got married and had kids. And I found it to be true. Like in the sacrificing for your family and for your kids, you feel like you really are part of the heritage that has brought you there. But when you get rid of that heritage, when you revise it and change it and then trash it and belittle it and decide that your whole life is living for yourself, it's a demoralizing story. And that's why people are killing themselves, I think, at rates that we've never seen before. But I don't, and And that's why I think that the best way to get back to the biblical story is by telling stories of heroes who decided to step into the role, was it Simba stepping into his role that Mufasa really, like, he wasn't expecting to die and be trampled, right? But it's like, this is life and you have to step into that.
Right, which is what we used to do. It used to be at the center of our philosophy of education. And the education was, even in a secular view, the purpose was to create a useful citizen.
Yeah.
And a major way of doing that, starting back with the Greeks, but certainly in our country as well, is to present models of people behaving well.
Yeah.
And also people behaving badly and showing the consequences.
Yeah.
So we tell the mythic story of George Washington cutting down the cherry tree.
Yeah.
Well, now nobody really thinks that ever happened, but it's still, still the idea of I cannot tell a lie.
Yeah.
Is pretty important.
Or Honest Abe, when somebody overpaid. Do you know that one where he was working and somebody overpaid and they left and he realized they gave him like a penny extra and he ran like 5 miles to give it back to him? It's like
a guy. I'd vote for him.
Yeah, I would too. Yeah. I would too. But those are the stories. Yeah.
So now education is centered on the expressive individualism. Yeah. You can be anything you want to be, which is a lie.
Right. It's actually not true.
I grew up for a long time convinced that God wanted me to play for the Dodgers.
Right.
And that anything less would be going against God's will.
Right.
And it turned out I don't have enough hand-eye coordination to hit a fastball.
Right. I thought I was going to play for the Bulls.
So but it's one of many lies that we tell. Yeah. But of course, like most lies, or like most effective lies, it has a kernel of truth in it.
Right.
There's a relationship between effort and outcome.
Yeah.
So if you dedicate yourself and do, in some cases it can affect, but this idea that, as you say, it comes into gender politics, you are whatever you think you are.
Yeah. Right.
To which my response is, I'm old enough that nobody can cancel me, so I'm courageous now in my old age.
Yeah.
Is there are people who genuinely believe in the world that they're animals.
Mm-hmm.
They think they're a zebra. They think they're a horse.
Yeah.
Are you saying that because they think they're a horse, they are a horse?
Yeah.
That they are a zebra? That they are a kangaroo?
Yeah.
Or is there something maybe that isn't right in the brain?
Yeah.
And
I think it's a complete.
it's so
mental
irrational.
disability. Yeah.
It's so irrational for a supposedly rational culture.
Yeah. Oh no, I agree with that. And we don't look at it that way, and then these people suffer because of it, because nobody cares about them and says, hey, you can't think that way.
Well, they
That's
don't.
Not real.
They actually think they care about them, but caring about them means I have to affirm you in whatever you
say,
and whatever you choose or say, you have to be affirmed.
Yeah, right. And
because it might make them feel bad, and if you've made somebody feel bad, then you've sinned against them somehow.
And that's another way in which the story has gone off course, because the biblical definition of love is sacrifice. It's not affirmation.
Right.
Now you become affirmed into the family of God after you've been born again, and it's now not I, but Christ in me. And so there's a whole theology to that. But love has never biblically been just affirming. Actually, that's hate. That's actually hate, because human beings are sinful and their nature is evil. And so if you just affirm everything in them, you're actually just making them into terrible, terrible humans. So the biblical narrative of love is to sacrifice, but it is to sacrifice your life, but your reputation, your standing in a particular relationship. Right. I mean, this is something that I've thought has been interesting, is that love, it has to kind of reach itself into all aspects of life, from just interpersonal relationships. If you really love somebody, you should be willing to give up the relationship for the truth, for the betterment of them.
Right.
And I've seen that be such like a maze for people to try to figure out. Like, I don't want to tell the person the truth. It's going to hurt their feelings. Or it's like they try to psychoanalyze the situation. It's like,
or it might make them angry.
Yeah, it's like, well, if it makes them angry, but what they don't recognize that they're doing, I think, is that they're actually sacrificing their relationship to God, but they just are materialistic and they don't recognize that they're sacrificing.
Well, they're also putting at risk the person who they refuse to tell the truth to.
Yeah.
So and people talk about tough love and things like that, and that's a real thing.
Yeah.
I mean, love love is willingness to sacrifice for. And you shouldn't say you love an idea, a philosophy, a way of life, or a person unless you're willing to sacrifice for that.
Yeah. Well, here's a question I'll ask, because you've written obviously a lot of books that are very much conceptual. You're just talking about ideas. I mean, you wrote the book on story, but it's you didn't. And then you've written other actual stories. You've written narratives and things like that. So you found, it seems like, unless you wrote those for no reason, I don't think that's the case. It sounds like, or it seems like you think that one of the best ways for the story culturally to change is for individuals and churches and groups and people to come together practically and start actually writing new stories and producing new stories that point towards the true story of Christ. Right?
Yeah. Well, I think the church and individuals need to value the whole creation, the whole of what God created, and not be selective, which includes the imagination. And I grew up in Christian subcultures that were very suspicious about the imagination because they equated imagination with falsehood, like you just made that up, and it affected how they viewed the Bible, and all kinds of things. So great storytellers are probably the most powerful people in human history.
Yeah,
and sometimes it is a political figure like Lincoln or someone like that, or sometimes it's a great philosopher, but many times it's a great novelist, a great poet, a great writer of children's fiction and that kind of thing. So one thing I've been in many different churches and over my lifetime, and it's the rare church that celebrates the artist of its church, or the poets of its church, or the writers in its church. And how do you do that? Well, you hang their stuff on the wall, and you let them speak occasionally. Or you not only let them, you invite them, you encourage them to speak and talk about your calling and that kind of thing. So I'm a big fan and promoter of. In some ways, it's self-serving because I was a lit professor, so. But why was I drawn to lit in the first place? I didn't go to college thinking I was going to be a lit professor. I was drawn by the power of the stories that were presented to me, and a lot of them were secular. I think Christians have to show respect for all healthy art, because a lot of secular thinking and art and stuff is rooted in the fact that God made them, and God has given them talents. God even gives people wisdom. So I learned from Camus, who was not a Christian. I respect other religions because I think they have partial truths. They understand some things. Maybe they understand things that Christians need to be reminded about regarding, the capital T truths of Christianity. Even about the willingness to sacrifice for their faith. So churches, I think generally, maybe I'm speaking especially about American churches, to broaden their idea of Christ's dominion in the world and the things that Christ is interested in and that has given people gifts for. So why did I wrote, one of my early books was Letters to My Children, which was a collection, it grew specifically out of the feeling that I was probably in my mid-30s and my kids were little, between the ages of maybe 5 and 9. And I realized there's no guarantee I'm going to live to see these kids grow up. I got to, I have a responsibility to pass on some things to them. Right. And I might not be there to say the right thing when they're 15, 16, 18. So I started writing letters to them. I never gave them to them with no intention, but I put them in a drawer and thought, well, if I die, they'll discover my letters. And this is their dad talking to them. Right. So, but what did I find out? And my idea was I want to pass on values to them. And I found out that in writing those letters, every time I wanted to talk about a value, I told a story from my own life. Often from my own childhood, because I wanted them to identify, you're this age. How was I thinking when I was your age? And so I start off to tell a story about asking the lame girl to dance in 6th grade. She's had polio. She's got a bad leg. She's got arms drawn up. Nothing in life is telling her that she is a success, that she's not pretty enough, she's not athletic, she's not blah, blah, blah. So what happens? The student teacher, who is a 20-year-old woman from the college that I eventually end up going to years later, takes me aside, and we used to have to work on square dancing. And I didn't like it at all. and I came from a subculture that was suspicious of any kind of dancing. But this she was a Christian, and she said, Dan, next time we do square dancing, I want you to choose Mary. Because the boys, and this is a very 1950s thing, the boys would all line up at the door, and then each boy would pick a partner, which is horrific now.
They did that.
I mean, think about as you're a girl sitting out there waiting, where are you on the pecking order? And Mary was the last one chosen.
Yeah. Right,
all right, so she says, I want you to choose Mary. It was inconceivable to me. I was 12 years old. I'm all about athletics, competition, being the best at anything.
Right. Image.
Yeah. Why would I choose Mary when there was Linda, Shelley, or even Doreen? But then she
very 1950s names.
But then she said what I thought was totally unfair at the time. She said it's what a Christian should do.
Oh, interesting.
And I knew immediately I was doomed. That oh my gosh, this is exactly the kind of thing Jesus would have done. And as I wrote in the letter to my kids. In fact, I'm surprised I haven't seen it on a Sunday school flannel board yet. Jesus choosing the lame girl for the yeshiva dance. It's bound to be somewhere in the Bible. Yeah. So, in fact, I did choose Mary after a lot of agonizing, because what did the master teacher do? He made me first in line. Oh, and I thought, okay, I hope I'm last in line. Then I'll choose Mary.
Then you can just
no problem.
Yeah, right.
No, Dan, choose your partner.
Wow.
And I look at Mary, and she's not, all the other girls are turning toward the side and back of the room to see. She's looking straight down at her desk.
Yeah.
And she says, and I say, when heart racing, I choose Mary. And her head comes up, and she looks back at me with this incredible smile and embarrassment. She turns red. And I, as I said in the letter, I had to turn away because I knew I didn't deserve it. And we, she took my arm and we marched up and I end the letter by saying, I hope, I haven't seen Mary since that year. I hope she has at least one fond memory of 6th grade. All right. So I don't know where Mary's gone in life. Yeah. But over and over again. So that's a story. I don't know what that story is about. It's about compassion. It's about kindness. But whatever I wanted to convey to my kids, that story rose up.
Yeah, right.
And I hadn't thought about that since the event. Yeah. I wasn't like, oh, this is my favorite story. It's just, bam, that came. And so I found out almost every time I was trying to convey something about God or faith or marriage or anything, a story arose. So that actually, almost even more than being a lit professor, that made me start thinking about, how is it that stories are so powerful? How is it that they are the conveyors of meaning? They are the conveyors of values. Right. And it led to me writing the book, Tell Me a Story, where I tried to analyze that. But even though I approached that not really academically, but intellectually, that book also is full of stories that to try to illustrate what it is. So what's the church do? The church, be true to your story, defend your story, live it out graciously and winsomely, but also truthfully. Yeah. You don't want to be so winsome that you sacrifice the truth to it. Yeah. But the truth will set you free, we're told.
And it'll win those who it's supposed to win.
Right. So just live out the best story you can, and then let God take care of the rest. Yeah. And if it turns out that society that we're heading toward end times, and whether it's successful or not is not important. You're not called to be successful. You're called to be faithful.
That story that you just told is interesting. As you were saying, I couldn't stop thinking about, I have a cousin who who's weirdly all the biological cousins, my younger cousin and my older cousin, we've all born on the same August 2nd, but just in different years. She grew up in a Christian family, and she was like on fire for Christianity, and then just kind of blindsidedly out of nowhere walked away from the faith, and doesn't really talk to anybody in the family anymore. Really doesn't talk to her parents. And a couple of years back, I like reached out to her to see if she would talk. Because I, in families, everybody talks about it, but you don't really know actually what happened. And so I just wanted to get the facts, I guess, for what happened. And we talked on the phone, and because I remembered her, she's like about 10 years older. I remember her just being on fire. Like she wanted to be a missionary and all those things. And she was totally different now. And I asked her, like what happened? And she was just like, well, she kind of told me a story about as a kid. She was like, when I was a kid, I used to pray that like God would, before she'd go to school, that God would like show her somebody to talk to about him. And she'd go to school and she'd see somebody sitting at a table alone at lunch. And then she would feel like the Holy Spirit was leading her in that direction. So she'd go talk to him. And because I asked her, like, what do you think about the Holy Spirit then? She was like, those types of situations. She was like, well, what she concluded on that was what was actually happening was it was kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, and kind of anybody would do that because people are good people. I asked her, why didn't anybody else do it? Why were you the only one who did it? And she's smart. She just sat there in silence for like 5 or 10 minutes. Didn't have an answer for that. Haven't talked to her since. I don't know. But as you were, I don't know where she landed on that. I hope she landed on that. That was the Holy Spirit telling her to go over there, and that the reason nobody else did it was because they weren't being led by something that was bigger than themselves. Right. But that story that you're talking about, like that's actually I feel like everybody has to kind of go through that in certain ways, where you're like prompted into doing something that you don't even know, like you're reluctant to it. I feel like I've had these situations growing up as well, but for some reason that connected to the thing the conversation that I had with my cousin. And I think it points to the deeper truth of like the blind faith of the Christianity. Like you just do the thing that God's telling you to do, and you don't fully understand it in the moment. And later on, maybe you have a deeper understanding of it. But that's interesting. In what ways have those stories that you've written out for your kids, or just, the ways in which you've experienced stories in your own life, played a part in the novels that you've actually written, the stories that you've actually created that are not these real stories, but are they in any ways manifestations of that in literature? Yeah. Well,
I've written short stories, not a huge number, but here and there throughout my adult life. Partly because I didn't have time to write anything longer, having a teaching position and all that. But I came to the conclusion that if I'm going to say that I really value stories and that a lot of my life has been teaching fiction, that I should actually ethically even do it. And so I started with a novel called Death Comes for the Deconstructionist. But because of my own, the first thing we tell students in Interlit is don't confuse the characters with the author. And I have a first-person narrator who's basically, the opening line of the first novel is the voices are back. And this guy is fighting multiple personality. I never say that in the novel, but he's kind of falling apart. And he's a serial failure. He's pretty much failed at everything he's done, including his marriage. But he has this sister, and this sister is, and again, I never say this. Basically, she's Downs. She has Down syndrome. Not sure even how you're correctly supposed to say that anymore.
Yeah, I think that's fine.
But she grows directly out of my experience with my wife. When we were in our 20s for 3 years, we ran a group home for mentally challenged adults. And this character, this wonderful woman who was older than we were, she was probably, maybe pushing 40 at the time, was just the essence of a sweet spirit. I thought of her, I think of her as a natural saint. that and of compassion and tenderness and all this kind of stuff. So I thought, she's got to be in this novel. And it turns out she's his sister, and she's the moral center. And then there's a total of 4 novels. She's the moral center of all of them. And all she can say is Jesus. She's so simple that her answer to every problem is Jesus. And it sort of irritates her brother because he's a failed intellectual. He tried to get a Ph.D. and his dissertation was rejected, et cetera. And he's got all these problems. But through the 4 novels, he's being healed in great part because of, excuse me, of living with his sister after having not lived with her, because he takes her on and out of the group home and live with her, and she's healing him. So, and I, in every novel, I have at least one church service, because modern fiction has, Christianity's pretty much disappeared from modern fiction. Right. I thought, I'm going to have a church service in every novel. And some of them are good church services and some of them aren't so good. But I thought, as I try to create this story, what's my master story? What's the ultimate purpose of spending months writing a novel? It's got to at least indirectly reflect God's story. Yeah. But not in a propagandistic way. This isn't a sermon. This isn't evangelism straight up. This isn't other ways which call for other strategies. This is to tell a good story. And to tell a good story, you have to have believable characters, interesting characters. You've got to explore the human experience as it really is, not as you wish it was. So, and I didn't, really start even toying with this until I was, I don't know, maybe mid-40s. But I thought, I tended to bring to bear on my own fiction writing the things that I had explored, not abstractly, because I do tell a lot of stories, but explored more academically or rationally in the other books. And now here's a chance to make it come alive, or make it, to see if it really is true, if it really works.
Well, have you ever read the Pilgrim's Regress by C.S. Lewis?
I think I've read almost all C.S. Lewis, but I've been reading him for 65 years. So,
it all blends together.
Did that one get in there? I don't remember.
Yeah, the C.S. Lewis, the Pilgrim's Regress was just the first book published as a Christian for him. Yeah, and so kind of his testimony, but in dream allegory, like the Pilgrim's Progress. His character John is born in Puritania, in which they all just blindly follow the landlord. The landlord tells them what to do and where to go, but they don't really ask questions. And the landlord also gives them these rules that they have to follow, but they don't have any really understanding of why they're doing it. And of course, his character John is having these visions in his head of this beautiful island that he longs for, but he doesn't know where to get it. And anyways, the book is a journey for him trying to find that island. Of course, that island is Christ, but he doesn't recognize it. And he goes through all these different philosophies, these different towns and places. He meets Mr. Enlightenment. And one of the funniest parts in the book, he meets Mr. Enlightenment, and then he later on in the book meets Mr. Enlightenment's son. And Mr. Enlightenment's son thinks that Mr. Enlightenment is an idiot.
Yeah, right.
I just think that's one of the funniest things I've ever heard.
Well, that's what's happened in our culture with postmodernism. Yeah. What they think of the Enlightenment.
Yeah. Well, okay. One thing that I found interesting about scholarly people like yourself, and C.S. Lewis, or Christians, is that they emphasize the simplicity of the gospel. You would think that the people like C.S. Lewis would emphasize the the vast complexity of Christ and the gospel
that only a few of us can understand.
Yeah, that only a few of us can understand, but it's the exact opposite, right? Like John, the character John, as he travels north into hyper-rationalism and south into romanticism, he can't find, he reaches this chasm, and he goes north of the chasm is hyper-rationalism. No, everybody's just telling him that this is kind of the end of things, but he's like, no, I see something more. And there's this lady, this old woman who says, I can take you across the chasm. You'll find what you're looking for. And he's like, you can't take me anywhere. And it's this simple old Mother Kirk, which is the representation of the church to take him to Christ. And then your story, right? Like the sister is just this girl with Down syndrome who only can say Jesus. It's like the simple truth at the center of it. And these characters have to confront the simple truth to bring them to the ultimate truth. Why? Like, I get it. I understand it. But like, why is that like the most impactful thing that you could think of? And I'm not saying that in a negative way. I think that is the most impactful thing. But what was it about the simplicity of the message of Jesus, or, for C.S. Lewis, the message of Christ?
Well, I mean, part of my answer would be that God knows how comparatively simple-minded we are.
Yeah.
Including the people who think they're the smartest.
Yeah.
I mean, wisdom is practical knowledge about how to live. And it doesn't necessarily go to the most intelligent or to the most educated. So in I lived in small towns and small churches, and sometimes the cleaning lady, even as a kid, I knew she had more wisdom than the smart guy sitting in the row behind her, because she had lived. She had learned from living, and she'd learned from God and learned from Scripture and learned all kinds of things. So God made it simple to be universal, so that no one would have an excuse of, well, that's just too complicated. That's and why would it need to be complicated? Why do we? I mean, I think we enjoy, especially academics, complexity because we think we're good at it. And therefore, we can create a kind of hierarchy of how complex this is, and only a handful of us are capable, which is bogus. On
the opposite end of that, though, I think that complexity can be an easy scapegoat for belief, right?
Yeah, it can be you can use it to cover truth, rather than discover truth.
Yeah. That's what academia is today. We're going to ask the questions. Everything's about asking questions. It's never about answering any of them.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and actually, it's against the rules to find an answer.
Yeah, I know.
So, I mean, especially
and you're a bigot.
Well, for skeptics, if not settling for any answer is supposedly a sign of intelligence. So, but my feeling is, if you're asking important questions, you have to at least be willing to accept important answers.
Yeah.
Yeah,
there's a verse in,
because you don't have to commit. If you never can say this is true, then you don't have to take the risk. I mean, that's actually the subtitle of a book I wrote. The first book I wrote, called Myth of Certainty, is the risk of commitment.
Yeah,
because it is a risk.
Totally.
And if you're totally risk averse, which a lot of atheists are and a lot of rationalists are, then don't commit to asserting the truth of almost anything. It's certainly not something that can't be proven scientifically.
Yeah. We can wrap this up here, but I want to ask what's your vision? What's your, not even vision, what's your encouragement for young Christians and for young people for the next generations, right? Like I'm 25, I've got a lot of life left. What should I be doing and engaging in to change the cultural story? What's your encouragement?
Well, which is one of the confessions says I'm probably going to get this wrong. The aim of man is to know God and love and enjoy Him forever, or is it love God and enjoy Him forever?
I think it's no.
Okay, know God and enjoy Him forever. That's I don't think it's anything new. I think it's just the old stuff of understand better and continue to understand better this Christian story. And I encourage study in that. So it's not all emotion. Read. I always tell young people, read 5 books from the past for every book you read of a contemporary writer.
Yeah.
Just a rule of thumb. You'll learn a lot. And go all the way back. Go back to Julian of Norwich and to Pascal and to, and then you occasionally read a Christian bestseller, but it's likely to be much thinner than that. So know and live the story to the best of your ability, and join with others who do.
Yeah.
And so if you aren't happy with the church, then find a church that does a better job, or that at least has enough humility to say, we'll try our best together.
Yeah.
So it's I mean, the Christian story is the greatest story ever told.
Yeah.
It's called that for a reason. How many stories are as ultimately joyous as the Christian story, and have as full as meaning as the Christian story,
and are as durable.
So you're blessed. You're blessed to have been exposed to the story. Live it for, with all the strength you can.
Yeah, yeah. The appetites. Growing up, my appetite was like expressive individualism, sex. I mean, a lot of young people my age are like, I don't know how I could change my appetites. How could I want to do what you're talking about? How could I want to read old books? What I've found is, once I push through that initial kind of not really wanting to do that, and that's all I'm hungry for it now. I'm hungry for the wisdom of the past and the knowledge and the stories that shaped the world that I live in. And then that hunger has made me want to actually go and do that myself, to put myself into.
And if you take no pleasure in reading, then volunteer.
Yeah.
Devote yourself to action, but put yourself with other people, and the story that you will be living a story, even if you don't want to read them.
Yeah.
And you're going to be exposed to stories and characters and plots and outcomes and choices, because you don't have to read to find stories.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Well, thanks for doing this podcast.
Sure. Awesome. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah.